President Trump is calling for a major investigation of voter fraud as he continues to stand by lies about the 2016 election, despite the fact his claims have been widely debunked. In New York, we're joined by Dale Ho, director of the Voting Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union. His op-ed in the New York Times is headlined, "Trump's Lies Pave the Way for an Assault on Voting Rights." How?
Well, Amy, throughout history, specious and unsubstantiated allegations about voter fraud have been used to justify measures that restrict voting rights. This was true 100 years ago when states in the South were passing things like poll taxes and literacy tests. They said, we have to charge people money for their votes because if we don't, then poor people will sell their votes. We have to make sure that voters can read because if they can't, then someone is going to be telling them how they should vote, and on and on and on. And you look, closer to the present, and during the 1980s, what Senator Jeff Sessions, the president's nominee for Attorney General, was most infamous for was for a failed voter fraud prosecution of 3 civil rights activists, one of whom was a close aide of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was one of the incidents that helped derail his nomination for a federal judgeship back then. And we see this again in more recent times with things like restrictive voter identification requirements and new registration restrictions. We don't have a really significant or systematic problem of voter fraud in this country. I think Americans should feel secure that our voting systems are of very high integrity. What we have a problem with in this country is a low participation rate, and we should be doing everything we can to encourage more people, not fewer, to participate.
The whole issue of people voting illegally has morphed. It was originally Donald Trump was talking about, illegal immigrants, not a word we use. Don't think any person is illegal, but undocumented people who are not supposed to be able to vote. But then the examples he's using are all the people in his cabinet and many people in his family who are registered in more than one state. He keeps insisting that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. And he says all of those people, and he was very clear about this, not one of them voted for him, voted for, Hillary Clinton.
I think that's because he senses he has something of a legitimacy problem. He lost the election in terms of the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, which is by far the largest negative margin for anyone who has ever ascended to the presidency, certainly in contemporary times. So he knows that there is a legitimacy issue here. The Electoral College is obviously the law of the land, and we all recognize that. He is the president of the United States right now legally. But most people don't think that that's the appropriate way of selecting our leaders, that the legitimacy of our government derives from the consent of the majority. And I think he senses that. And that's probably why he's trying to attack the fact that he lost the popular vote.
And yet, interestingly, when Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, challenged the elections, wanted a recount in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, it was Donald Trump's lawyers who said that the election was not fraudulent.
That's right. When he was president-elect, President Trump's legal team stated in court in a filing something to the effect of there is no evidence, or all the available evidence, rather, suggests that the 2016 election was untainted by fraud or mistake. If that was true a few months ago, it remains true today. Just because he's now the president of the United States and the most powerful person in the world, he doesn't have the power to warp reality and change what was true a few months ago.
So The Guardian is reporting that Vice President Mike Pence has privately told lawmakers that the Trump administration will, quote, initiate a full evaluation of voting rolls in the country and the overall integrity of our voting system in the wake of this past election. The significance of this, the idea that this will lead to massive voter suppression, which is already taking place around the country, Dale.
Well, that's a concern. There are a number of states, as you alluded to, that have passed laws in the last 5 years that make it harder for people to register to vote and cast a ballot. The Department of Justice over the last few years has been very active in pushing back against those laws and fighting for the right of every American to participate. There are significant concerns that the new Justice Department is not going to fully enforce the Voting Rights Act and the constitutional protections for voting rights in this country, and that instead what we're going to see is a rerun of what we saw 15 years ago when the Bush Justice Department applied political pressure to U.S. attorneys around the country to investigate and prosecute voter fraud. They engaged in a 5-year project on this. They turned up very little evidence, only a few scattered instances of people voting when they weren't supposed to. U.S. attorneys around the country declined to devote a lot of resources to these investigations or to prosecute them in some cases, and they were fired for political reasons, and it was one of the reasons that Alberto Gonzales was removed as Attorney General. It was one of the largest scandals of the George W. Bush administration because the investigation was politicized. It wasn't a normal investigation free from political influence, and I think the concern is that we're going to see something along those lines yet again. One would hope that we would have learned from those mistakes in the past, but I guess time will tell.